The dust never settled in Clearwater Creek, even on the calmest days, when the sun hung like a brass button in the cloudless sky. Fine particles of earth danced in the air, coating everything in a thin film of red-brown grit. Margaret Calloway had grown accustomed to the taste of it on her lips, the feel of it between her teeth. It was the taste of poverty, of endless struggle, of a life that seemed determined to grind her down as surely as the wind wore away the rocks. She stood at the washboard behind their ramshackle house, her raw hands working mechanically through the pile of clothes. The lye soap stung the cracks in her skin, but she barely noticed any more. Pain had become as constant a companion as the dust itself. From inside the house came the sound of her brothers' voices, raised in yet another argument. Cards slapped against the wooden table, followed by the clink of coins. What few remained. "Damn your eyes, Thomas! That was my last dollar!" Should have folded when you had the chance. Henry, Lady Luck don't favor fools. Margaret's jaw tightened. 3 brothers she had, and not one of them worth the powder to blow him to hell. Thomas, the eldest at 32, had inherited their father's weakness for whiskey and cards. Henry, 2 years younger, possessed a mean streak that had only grown worse since their parents' deaths. And Samuel, barely 25, followed his brother's lead with the blind loyalty of a beaten dog. The screen door banged open, making her flinch. Thomas emerged, his face flushed with drink despite the early hour. His shirt hung open, revealing the pale chest of a man who'd never done an honest day's work when he could avoid it. "Margaret!" His voice carried that particular edge that meant trouble. "Get in here." She dried her hands on her apron, already worn thin from too many washings. "I've got work to finish. Thomas, the washing can wait. We need to talk." The way he said talk made her stomach clench. She'd heard that tone before, when he'd sold their mother's wedding ring, when he'd traded away their father's rifle, when he'd bartered off everything of value they'd ever owned. But surely there was nothing left. They'd already scraped the bottom of the barrel and found only splinters. Inside, the house was dim and stifling. Flies buzzed around the remnants of last night's meal, and the air reeked of stale tobacco and spilled whiskey. Henry sat at the table, shuffling a deck of cards with practiced ease, while Samuel slouched in the corner, picking at a splinter in the wooden wall. "Sit down, Maggie." Thomas gestured to a chair. "I'll stand." She kept her voice steady, though her heart had begun to race. "Whatever you got to say it quick. I've got work." Thomas exchanged glances with Henry, who smirked in a way that made Margaret's skin crawl. "Thing is, sister, we've got ourselves in a bit of a bind." "When don't you—" The words slipped out before she could stop them. Henry's smirk vanished. "Watch your tongue, girl. You're not too old for a lesson in manners." "Let me handle this," Thomas said, though his eyes had hardened. "We owe money, Maggie. A lot of money. To the wrong sort of people." Margaret felt the familiar weight of dread settling on her shoulders. "How much?" $500. The number hit her like a physical blow. $500 might as well have been 5,000. "You can't be serious." "Dead serious," Henry interjected. "And if we don't pay up by week's end, we'll be dead in truth." Samuel finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "They mean it. Maggie, Jake Morrison don't make idle threats." Jake Morrison. Margaret knew the name. Everyone in Clearwater Creek did. He ran the saloon, the gambling tables, and had his fingers in every dirty deal from here to Tucson. Cross him, and you'd be lucky if they found enough of you to bury. "So what do you expect me to do?" Margaret asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "I've got nothing. You know that. You've already taken everything." Thomas stood, pacing to the window. He stared out at the dusty street beyond, his shoulders tense. "There is one thing. One way out?" "No." The word came out sharp as a gunshot. He turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw something that chilled her to the bone. Not cruelty, exactly, but a complete absence of conscience. The look of a man who'd weighed his sister's life against his own and found hers wanting. "You haven't even heard the offer. I don't need to. Whatever you're thinking, the answer is no. Henry slammed his hand on the table, making the cards jump. You don't get to say no. This is our lives we're talking about. And what about my life? Margaret's voice rose despite herself. When has that ever mattered to any of you? Coleman Black wants a wife. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the stifling air. Margaret stared at Thomas, certain she'd misheard. Coleman Black? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. You've lost your minds. The man's a savage. He's the richest rancher in 3 territories. Thomas countered. Owns half the valley and more cattle than God himself. And he's willing to pay. Pay? The word tasted like bile. You mean buy? You want to sell me like livestock? Samuel shifted uncomfortably. It ain't like that. Maggie, you'd be his wife. All legal and proper. Better life than you got here. A better life. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. With a man who's killed more men than cholera? Who they say talks to wolves and practices heathen magic? Who no decent woman would go near? Rumors, Thomas said dismissively. Wild talk. The man's just different. Keeps to himself. Because he's mad as a rabid dog. Henry stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Mad or not, he's offered $600 for you. Cash money, enough to pay Morrison and have something left over. $600? The price of her life, her freedom, her future. Margaret felt the room spinning around her, the walls closing in like a trap. I won't do it. You will. Thomas's voice had gone cold as winter steel. One way or another, you'll go to him. Because if you don't, Morrison will kill us. All of us. And then what do you think happens to you? A woman alone, no family, no protection. You know what this town does to women like that. She did know. She'd seen the hollow-eyed creatures who worked the rooms above the saloon. Aged before their time. Diseased and desperate. At least as Coleman Black's wife. She'd have a roof, food, some semblance of respectability, even if it came attached to a man who made decent folk cross the street to avoid him. When? The word came out as a whisper. Thomas's shoulders relaxed slightly. Day after tomorrow. He'll come for you at dawn. 2 days. 2 days of freedom left. Margaret turned and walked out without another word, ignoring Henry's victorious chuckle and Samuel's guilty silence. She made it to the backyard before her legs gave out, dropping her to her knees beside the wash bucket. The wet clothes lay forgotten as she pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to hold back the tears, but they came anyway, hot and bitter as the desert wind. She cried for the parents who died and left her to these wolves in brothers' clothing. She cried for the dreams she'd once harbored, modest dreams of a small home, a kind husband, children who'd know love instead of neglect. Most of all, she cried for the girl she'd been, the one who'd believed that family meant something, that blood bonds couldn't be broken by greed. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood, Margaret finally stood. She wiped her face with her apron and returned to her washing, movements mechanical but determined. If she had only 2 days left as Margaret Calloway, she'd spend them with her dignity intact. That night, after her brothers had drunk themselves into stupors, she crept out onto the sagging porch. The desert stretched endlessly before her, bathed in silver moonlight. Somewhere out there, Coleman Black waited in his fortress of a ranch, probably no more aware of her as a person than he would be of a horse he'd purchased sight unseen. The stars wheeled overhead, countless and cold, indifferent to human suffering. Margaret had never felt so small, so utterly alone. Yet, as she stood there, something stirred within her. Not hope exactly, but a kind of fierce determination. They could sell her body, force her into a stranger's bed, take away her name and her freedom. But there were things inside her they could never touch, never own. Her thoughts, her spirit, the core of who she was. She remembered her mother's words, spoken years ago when Margaret had asked why she stayed with their father despite his drinking and gambling. Sometimes, child, we women must be like the mesquite tree. We bend with the wind to keep from breaking, sink our roots deep where others see only barren ground, and find ways to bloom even in the harshest drought. Margaret hadn't understood then. She did now. A coyote howled in the distance, its cry echoing across the empty lands. Tomorrow would bring what it brought, but tonight, under the vast indifference of the stars, Margaret Calloway made a promise to herself. She would survive this. She would endure, and somehow, someday, she would find a way to be free, truly free. Not just in body, but in soul. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant rain. Change was coming, whether she willed it or not. All she could do was meet it with whatever courage she could muster, and pray that Coleman Black possessed at least a shred of the humanity the stories denied him. 2 more days. Then Margaret Calloway would cease to exist, and in her place would stand Mrs. Coleman Black, whoever that woman might prove to be. The morning came wrapped in a shroud of red dust. Margaret stood at her bedroom window, watching the sun claw its way above the horizon like something desperate to escape the earth's grip. She'd been awake since the first cock crow, her few possessions already packed in a worn carpet bag that had belonged to her mother. Downstairs, she could hear Thomas moving about, unusually sober for the occasion. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he paced, nervous as a cat in a thunderstorm. Even he, it seemed, felt some unease at what they were about to do. Margaret dressed carefully in her best dress, a faded blue calico that had seen better days but was clean and pressed. She braided her long auburn hair with steady hands, though her stomach churned like a butter churn. In the cracked mirror, a pale young woman stared back at her, green eyes too large in a face grown thin from worry and want. "He's coming!" Samuel's voice cracked from downstairs. "I can see the dust." Margaret's hand stilled. Through her window, she could indeed see a plume of dust rising from the east, growing larger with each moment. Her time had run out. She descended the stairs with measured steps, chin high despite the trembling in her legs. Her brothers waited in the front room, Thomas attempting to look authoritative, Henry smirking with satisfaction, and Samuel unable to meet her eyes. "Remember," Thomas said, "you're to be respectful. This man is our salvation." "Your salvation," Margaret corrected quietly. "Built on my bones." The sound of hooves grew louder, and then stopped. Heavy footsteps crossed the porch. Thomas yanked open the door before the knock came, eager as a merchant displaying his wares. Margaret's first glimpse of Coleman Black stole the breath from her lungs. He filled the doorway like a force of nature, tall enough that he had to duck his head to enter. The morning light caught on hair black as a raven's wing, worn longer than was fashionable, tied back with a leather cord. His face was all hard angles and shadows, high cheekbones that spoke of Indian blood, a jaw that could have been carved from granite, and eyes the color of whiskey held to firelight. Those eyes swept the room once, dismissive of the men, before settling on Margaret with an intensity that made her want to step backward. He wore black from head to toe, black shirt, black vest, black duster that fell to his boot heels. The only color came from the silver of his belt buckle and the ivory handles of the twin colts riding his hips. Every line of him spoke of controlled violence, of a man who'd walked with death so long it had become a comfortable companion. "Mr. Black," Thomas stammered, extending his hand. "Welcome to our humble—" "The girl." Black's voice was low, rough as gravel. He ignored Thomas's outstretched hand entirely. "That her?" Margaret bristled at being discussed like livestock. But before she could speak, Thomas rushed to answer. "Yes, sir. This is Margaret. Margaret, come here." She stayed where she was. "I have eyes, Mr. Black, and ears. If you have something to say about me, you can say it to me." Henry hissed in warning, but Black's lips twitched in what might have been amusement. He stepped fully into the room, and suddenly the space seemed too small to contain him. "Spirited," he observed, still addressing Thomas. "You didn't mention that. She's been properly raised." Thomas said quickly, "She can cook, clean, mend, all the wifely duties. She's just—" upset about leaving home. This is home. Black's gaze traveled over the squalid room, taking in the empty whiskey bottles, the cards still scattered on the table, the general air of dissolution. Seems to me I'm doing her a favor. Margaret found her voice. A favor? You call buying a woman like a brood mare a favor? This time Black did look at her, really looked at her, and Margaret felt the force of his attention like a physical weight. I call it a business arrangement. Miss Calloway, your brothers need money. I need a wife. Simple as that. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. A man like you could have any woman in the territory. Why buy one who doesn't want you? Because, he said slowly, a woman who doesn't want me won't have expectations, won't talk about love or tenderness or any of that foolishness. She'll do her duty. I'll do mine, and we'll both get on with our lives. The coldness of it made her shiver. At least her brother's cruelty came from weakness. This man's came from something far more dangerous, complete indifference. I haven't agreed to this, she said. No? Black reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch, heavy with coin. He tossed it to Thomas, who caught it greedily. Count it. 600, as agreed. Thomas's fingers shook as he opened the pouch, spilling gold coins onto the table. The sight of so much money rendered him temporarily speechless. Wait, Margaret said desperately. Just wait. I'm not ready. Got your things? Black asked, cutting through her protests. She's packed, Henry volunteered, eager to move things along. I'll get her bag. Everything was moving too fast. Margaret felt like she was drowning, swept along by a current too strong to resist. Henry returned with her carpet bag, thrusting it at Black, who took it without looking away from Margaret. Any goodbyes you need to say? Say them now. We've got ground to cover. Margaret looked at her brothers. Thomas was still mesmerized by the gold. Henry watched her with satisfaction, already calculating his share. Only Samuel showed any sign of shame, his face red and his eyes fixed on his boots. Goodbye then, she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. I hope that gold brings you all the happiness you deserve. Thomas finally looked up, perhaps hearing the curse in her blessing, but Black was already turning toward the door, clearly expecting her to follow. Come on, girl. Daylight's wasting. Margaret had a wild impulse to run, to bolt out the back door and keep running until she reached Mexico or California or anywhere else. But Black seemed to sense her thought, pausing in the doorway to look back at her. You can come willing or not, he said quietly. Makes no difference to me, but one way or another, you're coming. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. This man would chase her down like a wayward calf if necessary. Margaret straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and walked past him out the door, determined to salvage what dignity she could. His wagon waited outside, a sturdy buckboard pulled by two massive draft horses. In the back sat a grizzled older man with skin like leather and eyes that missed nothing. This is Ezra, Black said, helping Margaret up onto the seat with surprising gentleness. He runs the household. Anything you need, you tell him. Ezra touched the brim of his hat. Ma'am. Black swung up beside her, taking the reins with practiced ease. The wagon lurched into motion, and Margaret couldn't help but look back one last time at the house that had been her prison for so long. Her brothers stood on the porch, Thomas counting coins, Henry grinning, Samuel waving uncertainly. Then they rounded a corner, and her old life disappeared behind a cloud of dust. The journey stretched before them, endless as nightmare. The sun climbed higher, beating down mercilessly, and Margaret pulled her bonnet forward to shield her face. Beside her, Black drove in silence, handling the team with an ease that spoke of long practice. The landscape changed as they traveled, the scattered buildings of Clearwater Creek giving way to open desert. Saguaro cacti stood like ancient sentinels, their arms raised in benediction or curse. Hawks circled overhead, riding the thermals with lazy grace. In the distance, mountains rose like broken teeth against the brilliant blue sky. Water, Black said eventually, passing her a canteen. Margaret drank gratefully, the lukewarm water tasting better than wine. "How far is your ranch?" "Half a day's ride. We'll be there by sunset." Half a day sitting beside this stranger who owned her now. Margaret searched for something to say, some way to understand the man she'd been sold to. "Why do you need a wife so badly you'd pay for one?" He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Ranch that size needs a woman's hand. Been too long without one. You could hire a housekeeper. Hired help comes and goes. A wife stays, whether she wants to or not." He glanced at her then, those amber eyes unreadable. "You always this full of vinegar? When I'm being kidnapped. Yes, not kidnapping when money changes hands. That's commerce." The casual way he said it made her temper flare. "Then what am I? Your property?" "My wife. Or you will be. Once we reach the ranch. Judge Hartley will be waiting to make it legal." "Today?" Margaret felt panic rising again. "But I thought, I need time." "Time for what? To plan your escape? To hope your brothers grow consciences and come for you?" His laugh was harsh as a crow's call. "Best get those notions out of your head now, girl. You're mine, bought and paid for. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be." Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of him, not ever. The sun reached its zenith and began its slow descent. They stopped once to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. Margaret noticed how the animals responded to Black, coming to his whistle, standing quietly as he checked their hooves and adjusted their harnesses. Whatever else he was good with beasts. "You'll want to watch for rattlers," Ezra advised her as she stepped away to attend to personal needs. They like the shade of the rocks. When they resumed travel, the landscape had begun to change again. The desert gave way to grassland, vast stretches of golden prairie that rippled like a sea in the wind. In the distance, she could see cattle, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, dark shapes moving slowly across the range. "There," Black said, pointing, "that's the beginning of my land." Margaret looked where he indicated and gasped. The ranch stretched as far as the eye could see, an empire of grass and sky. In the distance, backed by a range of purple mountains, she could make out a cluster of buildings, barns, corrals, and a house that looked more like a fortress than a home. "All this is yours? Every acre, every head of cattle, every blade of grass." There was pride in his voice now, the first real emotion she'd heard from him. "Took me 15 years to build this spread, started with nothing but a horse and a rope and too much stubbornness to quit." Despite herself, Margaret was impressed. Whatever else Coleman Black was, he'd built something remarkable here. As they drew closer, she could make out more details. The main house was built of stone and timber, 2 stories tall with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. It looked solid enough to withstand siege, with thick walls and windows placed high. Ranch hands moved about their business, stopping to stare as the wagon approached. "They're not used to seeing women here," Black said by way of explanation. "You'll be the first in a long while." A man emerged from the house as they pulled up, elderly, dignified, wearing the black coat of his profession. Judge Hartley. Margaret realized with a sinking heart. They really meant to do this today. Black helped her down from the wagon, his hand strong on her waist. For a moment they stood close, and she could smell leather and horse and something wild, like sage after rain. Then he stepped back, all business again. "Judge, appreciate you coming out. Coleman." The judge's eyes were kind as they rested on Margaret. "Miss Calloway, I presume?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "This is highly irregular." The judge continued, looking between them. "Marriage is a sacred institution, not to be entered into lightly. I need to know this is what you both want." Margaret opened her mouth to protest, to scream that no, this wasn't what she wanted at all. But then she thought of her brothers, of the gold they'd already be spending, of what would happen if she refused now. Black wouldn't take her back. Her brothers wouldn't return the money. She'd be truly ruined then, cast out with nowhere to go. "It's what needs to be done," she said finally. The judge frowned but nodded. "Very well. Shall we proceed? And so, as the sun touched the horizon and painted the sky in shades of fire, Margaret Calloway became Margaret Black. The ceremony was brief, the vows traditional. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, Coleman brushed her cheek with the lips that were surprisingly soft, a kiss so quick she barely felt it. "Welcome home, Mrs. Black," he said, and the words sounded more like a prison sentence than a greeting. That night, she lay alone in a room larger than her entire family's house, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of her new home. Somewhere in the darkness, a wolf howled, long and mournful. Margaret pulled the covers higher and wondered if she'd simply traded one form of captivity for another. But at least here, she thought as sleep finally claimed her. The cages were gilded and the guards wore softer faces. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. Tonight, she was too weary to care. The rooster's crow came too early, pulling Margaret from dreams of her mother's garden. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then the unfamiliar weight of fine linen sheets and the size of the bed brought reality crashing back. She was Margaret Black now, wife to a stranger in a house that felt more like a fortress than a home. Pale dawn light filtered through heavy curtains. She rose, wrapping herself in the robe that had been laid out for her. Soft wool, finer than anything she'd ever owned. The house was quiet as a tomb as she ventured into the hallway, her bare feet silent on polished wood floors. She found the kitchen by instinct, following the smell of coffee and bacon. Ezra stood at the massive stove, working with the efficiency of long practice. He glanced up as she entered, no surprise on his weathered face. "Morning, ma'am. Coffee? Please." She accepted the steaming cup gratefully, wrapping her hands around its warmth. "Where is Mr. Black?" "Out with the dawn. Same as always, checking the herds, riding the boundaries. Man don't know how to rest." Ezra set a plate before her, eggs, bacon, biscuits with honey. "You'll want to eat up. Got a full day ahead." "What kind of day?" "Kind where you learn what it means to run a ranch house this size." His eyes were not unkind, but there was warning in them too. "Mr. Black don't hold with idleness. Everyone works here, from the lowest hand to the lady of the house." Margaret bristled. "I've worked every day of my life, Mr. "Just Ezra, ma'am, and I don't doubt it, but this ain't no 4-room shack in town. This house has 12 rooms, not counting the root cellar and smokehouse. There's meals for 20 men when they're all in from the range. Washing that never ends. Mending, cooking, preserving. Previous housekeeper left 6 months back, and we've been making do since." "Why did she leave?" Ezra busied himself with the stove. "Mr. Black can be particular. Takes a certain constitution to weather his moods." Before Margaret could ask what he meant, the back door slammed open. Coleman Black strode in, bringing with him the scent of horse and leather and morning air. His eyes found her immediately, taking in her nightclothes with an expression she couldn't read. "You're up. Good." He poured himself coffee, drinking it black and scalding. "Ezra will show you your duties. I'll expect dinner at 6 sharp. We eat in the dining room." "And where will you be?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended. He paused at the door, looking back. "Working. Same as you should be." Then he was gone, leaving Margaret staring after him with growing anger. Her husband of less than 12 hours, and he couldn't spare more than a handful of words for her? "Don't take it personal," Ezra said quietly. "He's not much for morning conversation. Or any conversation, truth be told. Then why did he want a wife? That's a question you'd best ask him. Now, if you're finished eating, we'd best get started. This house won't run itself." The morning passed in a blur of instruction. Ezra showed her through the house, parlor, library, dining room, Coleman's study, which she was not to enter without permission. The 4 bedrooms upstairs, the vast kitchen with its pantries and cold storage. Everything was well made but stark, functional rather than comfortable. No pictures on the walls, no flowers in vases, no soft touches anywhere. "Bachelor's house," Ezra explained. "Mr. Black's mother died when he was young. Been no woman's hand here since. Margaret found herself studying the bare walls, the empty corners crying out for something, anything, to make them less austere. Would he mind if I made some changes? Can't say. You'd have to ask him. By noon, Margaret's head spun with all she'd needed to remember. The ranch hands began drifting in for the midday meal, rough men with sun-weathered faces who looked at her with curiosity and varying degrees of suspicion. She served them beef stew and cornbread, feeling their eyes follow her every movement. "So, you're the new Mrs. Black," one of them said, a young man with sandy hair and an easy smile. "Tom Garrett, ma'am. Pleased to meet you." "Mr. Garrett." She nodded politely, aware of the sudden tension in the room. "Best mind your manners, Tom," an older hand warned. "Boss finds out you're making eyes at his wife. You'll be picking your teeth out of the dirt." "Wasn't making eyes," Tom protested, but he dropped his gaze to his plate. Margaret escaped back to the kitchen, cheeks burning. Ezra glanced at her but said nothing, just handed her a bucket and brush. "Floors need doing," he said simply. She spent the afternoon on her knees, scrubbing floors that already looked clean to her eyes. Her dress, one of her few good ones, was soaked through with dirty water, her hands raw from the lye soap. This was no different from the work she'd done at her brother's house. Yet somehow it felt heavier here, weighted with the strange isolation of this place. The sun was slanting low when she heard boots on the porch. Coleman entered, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. His eyes swept over her, taking in her disheveled state, the bucket of murky water, the half-scrubbed floor. "You don't need to do that yourself. We have hands for such work." Margaret sat back on her heels, pushing a strand of hair from her face. "Ezra said everyone works here. Not like that." He frowned, and for a moment she thought she saw something, concern, guilt, flicker across his face. "Get up, get cleaned up. Dinner's in an hour." She stood stiffly, her knees protesting. "I haven't started cooking yet. Rosa will handle it tonight. She comes in from town to cook when needed." He paused at the stairs, not looking back. "Wear something suitable." Margaret stared after him, anger bubbling up again. Suitable? As if she had a wardrobe to choose from. As if she were some society lady with trunks full of gowns instead of a woman sold like cattle with nothing but the clothes on her back. She climbed the stairs to her room. Their room, technically, though Coleman had made no move to share it the night before. On the bed lay a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside, she found 3 dresses, simple but well made, in practical fabrics but with small touches of elegance. A note in stark handwriting read, "These should fit. More can be ordered. C.B." The gesture should have touched her. Instead, it made her feel more like property than ever, dressed up like a doll for his approval. Still, the dresses were finer than anything she'd owned, and she was practical enough to appreciate them even as she resented the giver. She washed and changed into a deep green dress that brought out her eyes, her hair, hopelessly tangled from the day's work. She pinned up as best she could. When she descended the stairs, Coleman waited in the dining room, changed into a fresh shirt, his hair still damp from washing. "Better," he said, pulling out her chair. Rosa, a plump Mexican woman with kind eyes, served them roasted beef with potatoes and greens. The food was excellent, but Margaret barely tasted it. They ate in silence, the clink of silverware on china the only sound. She studied him across the table, the way he cut his meat with precise movements, the controlled way he did everything, as if he feared what might happen if he ever let go. "Tell me about the ranch," she said finally, unable to bear the silence any longer. He looked up, seeming surprised she'd spoken. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. If I'm to be mistress here, I should understand how it works." Something that might have been approval flickered in his eyes. 20,000 acres, give or take, 3,000 head of cattle, 200 horses, 40 hands during roundup, 15 regular. We drive to Kansas come spring, sell to the eastern markets. And you built all this yourself. Started with a homestead claim and a lot of stubborn, bought out the neighbors when they gave up, fought off rustlers and Indians, survived droughts and floods and everything else this land could throw at me. His voice held pride, but also something else. A weariness, perhaps, or loneliness. Why here? Why this place? He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his wine glass. Man needs space, room to breathe without someone else's expectations closing in. Out here, the land don't care who your people were or what you've done. It only cares if you're strong enough to hold it. And are you strong enough? His eyes met hers, and she saw depths there that made her shiver. I'm still here, aren't I? After dinner, he disappeared into his study, leaving Margaret to explore on her own. She found herself in the library, running her fingers along the spines of books. Shakespeare, Milton, books on agriculture and animal husbandry, even some novels. Not what she'd expected from a man who seemed to communicate mainly in grunts and orders. He reads. Ezra appeared in the doorway, carrying a lamp. Every night, when the work's done, man's got more education than you'd think. Hearing him talk. Went to university back east before he came west. What happened? Why did he leave? That's his story to tell. If he chooses, some things a man keeps buried for good reason. That night, Margaret lay in her bed listening to the sounds of the house settling. Somewhere below, she could hear footsteps, Coleman's heavy tread pacing back and forth. What kept him awake? What ghosts haunted a man who'd built an empire in the wilderness, but couldn't seem to find peace within it? A sound outside made her rise and go to the window. In the moonlight, she saw him standing in the yard, still as a statue. As she watched, a shape materialized from the darkness. A wolf, massive and gray, approaching without fear. Coleman extended his hand, and the beast sniffed it before melting back into the night. Margaret's breath caught. The stories were true. Then, he did speak with wolves. What kind of man had she married? And more importantly, what did he expect from her beyond cooking and cleaning and wearing suitable dresses to dinner? She returned to bed but found no sleep. Tomorrow would bring more work, more silence, more questions without answers. But as the first wolf's howl rose in the distance, answered by another, then another, until the night rang with their wild music, Margaret made a decision. She would not be a ghost in this house, drifting through the days in silence. She would make Coleman Black see her, speak to her, treat her as more than just another acquisition for his empire, whether he liked it or not. She was his wife now, and Margaret Calloway, Margaret Black, had never been one to accept being ignored. The moon set, and darkness claimed the land. But in her heart, a small flame of determination flickered to life. She'd been sold. Yes, bought and paid for, but that didn't mean she had to be owned. Not by him, not by anyone, not ever again. The cattle rustlers struck at dawn, when the world balanced between night and day. Margaret woke to the thunder of hooves and the sharp crack of gunfire echoing across the valley. She flew to the window, heart pounding, in time to see riders streaming down from the northern ridge like a dark flood. Coleman was already gone. His side of the bed he'd never shared, cold to the touch. Through the window, she saw him mounting his black stallion, shouting orders to the hands who poured from the bunkhouse, still pulling on boots and checking weapons. "Stay inside!" Ezra burst through her door, a rifle in his gnarled hands. "Lock the doors. Keep away from the windows. This could get ugly." But Margaret had spent too many years being told to hide, to cower, to let men handle the dangerous work. She dressed quickly in a split skirt she'd found in the wardrobe, practical for riding, and headed for the door. "Where do you think you're going?" Ezra blocked her path. "Those are our cattle they're stealing, aren't they? This ranch belongs to me too now. Mr. Black will have my hide if Mr. Black isn't here." She pushed past him, surprising them both with her determination. "And I won't sit idle while thieves raid our land." In the barn, she found Tom Garrett saddling horses for the pursuit. He gaped at her appearance. "Mrs. Black, you can't—" "Saddle me a horse. Tom, a steady one." "Ma'am, I really don't think—" "Now, Tom." She'd learned that tone from Coleman himself, quiet but brooking no argument. He saddled a mare for her, a steady paint named Buttercup. Margaret had been riding since childhood, one of the few pleasures her father had allowed, and she swung up with practiced ease. Tom mounted his own horse, clearly torn between duty to protect her and fear of Coleman's wrath. They rode hard toward the sound of conflict. The main herd had been grazing in the eastern pasture, and the rustlers were trying to cut out a sizable portion, driving them toward the canyon passes where pursuit would be difficult. Coleman and his men were fighting to turn the cattle back, the air thick with dust and gun smoke. Margaret had never seen anything like it. Men on horseback wheeled and fired. Cattle bellowed and milled in confusion. And over it all, Coleman's voice rose like thunder, directing his men with sharp commands. He sat his horse like he'd been born to it, twin colts spitting fire as he drove into the thick of the fight. A rustler broke free from the melee, driving a dozen head toward the canyon. Without thinking, Margaret spurred her horse to intercept. The mare responded beautifully, stretching out into a full gallop across the broken ground. She had no gun, no plan beyond stopping the theft, but anger drove her forward, anger at these men who would steal what Coleman had worked so hard to build, what was now hers to protect as well. The rustler saw her coming and turned in the saddle, raising his pistol. Time slowed to a crawl. Margaret saw the black bore of the gun swing toward her, saw the man's finger tighten on the trigger, and knew with cold certainty that she was about to die. The shot never came. Coleman appeared like an avenging angel, his horse slamming into the rustler's mount. The two men went down in a tangle of limbs and leather. They rolled apart, both reaching for their guns, but Coleman was faster. His shot took the rustler in the shoulder, spinning him around before he collapsed. Coleman turned on Margaret, his face a mask of fury. "What in the hell are you doing out here?" Before she could answer, another rider bore down on them, a rustler who'd circled back. Coleman's guns were empty. No time to reload. Margaret acted on instinct, grabbing a coiled rope from her saddle and swinging it like a club. It caught the man across the face, knocking him from his horse. Coleman stared at her for a heartbeat, something unreadable flashing across his features. Then the battle swept over them again, and there was no time for words. They fought side by side as the sun climbed higher, Margaret using her horse to help turn the stolen cattle back toward the main herd, while Coleman and his men gradually gained the upper hand. She'd never felt so alive, blood singing in her veins as she wheeled and dodged through the chaos. By the time it was over, 4 rustlers lay dead, 3 more captured, and only a handful of cattle lost. The ranch hands looked at Margaret with new respect as she helped drive the herd back to safer pastures, her dress torn and dusty, her hair wild around her face. Coleman said nothing until they were back at the ranch. Then he cornered her in the barn, still vibrating with barely controlled anger. "You could have been killed. So could you." She met his gaze steadily, refusing to back down. "Those were our cattle, our ranch. I had every right." "Right." He stepped closer, and she could smell gunpowder and sweat and that wild sage scent that was uniquely his. "You think marriage gives you the right to get yourself shot? I think marriage makes us partners. Or is that not what you intended when you bought yourself a wife?" Something dangerous flashed in his eyes. "Partners? You want to be my partner? I want to be something more than furniture you dust off for dinner." They stood there, breathing hard, the air between them crackling with tension. Then Coleman did something unexpected. He laughed, not the bitter sound she'd heard before, but something genuine, almost surprised. "Furniture doesn't usually brain rustlers with a lasso. I was improvising. You were lucky. Lucky I was there. Lucky that rope connected. Lucky you didn't catch a bullet." The anger was fading from his voice, replaced by something that might have been concern. "Don't do that again. Then teach me to shoot." "What? If I'm going to help defend this ranch, I should know how to do it properly. Teach me to shoot, to ride like your men do, to work cattle. Make me a real partner, not just a decoration." He studied her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing options, calculating risks. "You have any idea what you're asking?" I'm asking you to see me as more than property, to trust me the way I'm trying to trust you." The word trust seemed to affect him strangely. He turned away, running a hand through his dust-caked hair. "Fine. Lessons start tomorrow at dawn, but if you're not ready to work harder than you've ever worked in your life, don't bother showing up." That night at dinner, there was a new energy between them. Coleman actually spoke without being prompted, telling her about the rustlers, a gang that had been plaguing the territory for months, growing bolder as they sensed weakness in the smaller ranches. "They'll be back," he said, cutting into his steak with precise movements. "Men like that don't give up easy. We bloodied them today, but their kind holds grudges. Then we'll be ready for them." He looked up at that "we," and she saw approval in his amber eyes. "You did well today. Foolish. But well, where'd you learn to ride like that?" "My father, before the drinking got bad, he used to take me out on the plains. Said a woman should know how to handle a horse as well as any man." The memory hurt less than she'd expected, softened by time and distance. Smart man. Coleman poured wine for both of them, a gesture that felt almost companionable. "What happened to him?" "Poker happened. Whiskey happened. He lost a horse in a card game. Tried to win it back, lost more. The spiral started there and never stopped." She took a sip of wine, finding courage in its warmth. "What about your family?" His jaw tightened. "Dead. I'm sorry. Long time ago." He stared into his glass as if it held secrets. "My father was a judge back in Pennsylvania. Thought the law was sacred, that justice always prevailed. He was wrong." Margaret waited, sensing this was more than he'd shared with anyone in years. "There was a man, powerful, connected. He wanted our land for the railroad. When my father wouldn't sell, things got ugly. Threats, vandalism, worse. My mother—" He stopped, knuckles white around his glass. "She died in a fire, accident. They said my father knew better but couldn't prove it. The law he'd served his whole life failed him when he needed it most. Coleman. He put a gun in his mouth 6 months later. I was 17. He drained his glass in one swallow. I came west the next day. Out here, justice comes from the barrel of a gun. Not some courtroom. Simple, clean, honest." The bitterness in his voice made her heart ache. She reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. He stiffened but didn't pull away. "I'm sorry," she said again, meaning it. "No one should lose their family that way. Everyone loses family eventually. Better to not have any at all." But his hand turned under hers, fingers interlacing briefly before he pulled away. "It's late. Dawn comes early if you're serious about those lessons." She was serious. The next morning found her at the corral as the sky lightened, dressed in the split skirt and a simple blouse. Coleman was already there, checking weapons with methodical precision. "First rule," he said without preamble. "A gun is always loaded, even when it's not. Never point it at anything you don't intend to destroy." He started with a single-shot rifle, teaching her to load, aim, breathe. His hands corrected her stance, impersonal but firm. She was acutely aware of his presence behind her, the warmth of him in the cool morning air. "Squeeze, don't pull, let it surprise you." The rifle kicked against her shoulder, the shot going wide. He adjusted her grip, his breath stirring her hair. Again. By the time the sun was fully up, her shoulder ached and her ears rang, but she was hitting the target more often than not. Coleman stepped back, something like pride in his expression. "Not bad for a morning's work. Tomorrow we'll try the pistol. And riding? Real riding, not side saddle nonsense." A smile tugged at his lips, a rare sight that transformed his harsh features. "Think you can handle it? Try me." Over the following weeks, a routine developed, dawn lessons in shooting and riding, mornings working with Ezra to manage the house, afternoons learning the business side of ranching from Coleman's carefully kept ledgers. She discovered he had a sharp mind for numbers, planning seasons ahead, calculating risks with the same precision he brought to everything. The hands grew used to seeing her around the corrals and pastures, no longer staring when she helped with branding or rode out to check the herds. Some, like Tom Garrett, were openly admiring of her transformation from town lady to ranch woman. Others remained skeptical, waiting for her to fold under the harsh realities of frontier life. But Margaret thrived. Her hands grew calloused, her skin bronzed by the sun, her body strong from the work. More than that, she felt a purpose she'd never known, a sense of belonging to something larger than herself. The ranch was becoming home in a way her brother's house never had been. And Coleman remained a puzzle, but one she was slowly learning to read. He was still taciturn, still prone to long silences and sudden departures. But there were moments, a shared smile over her improving marksmanship, a brush of hands as they worked side by side, conversations by the evening fire that stretched longer each night, when she glimpsed the man beneath the armor. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, she found the courage to ask, "Why did you really want a wife, Coleman? And don't say for cooking and cleaning. Rosa could do that." He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "A man builds something. He wants to know it'll outlast him. This ranch. It needs more than one lifetime to become what it could be." "Children," she said softly. "You want children?" "Heirs," he corrected, but there was something vulnerable in the way he said it. "Someone to carry on when I'm gone. Someone who'll understand what this place means. And that's all? Just breeding stock?" He turned to look at her then, and in the dying light, his eyes seemed to glow. That was the plan, yes. Was. Instead of answering, he stood abruptly. "Early start tomorrow. We're moving the herd to the south pasture." But as he passed her chair, his hand briefly touched her shoulder, a gesture so unexpected, so gentle, that it made her breath catch. She sat in the gathering darkness long after he'd gone inside, wondering if she was imagining the way the walls between them seemed to be crumbling, stone by careful stone. Change was coming to the Black Ranch, slow as spring thaw but just as inevitable, and Margaret found herself both thrilled and terrified by what that change might bring. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a dust-covered rider who wouldn't meet Margaret's eyes. She knew before opening it that the news would be bad. Good news never required such haste or generated such discomfort in the messenger. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal, recognizing Thomas's crude handwriting. "Sister, we are in dire straits. Morrison wants his interest. Says the original debt wasn't full paid. Demands another 300 or he'll come collecting personal. You know what that means. Your husband's got deep pockets. Time to dip into them. We'll be at the Silver Dollar in Clearwater come Friday. Don't disappoint. Your loving brothers." Loving brothers. The words tasted like ash. Margaret crumpled the letter, rage and fear warring in her chest. She'd thought herself free of them, had begun to believe she could build something new here, but the past had teeth, and it seemed determined to sink them into her newfound peace. "Bad news?" she startled. Coleman stood in the doorway of the kitchen, his expression unreadable as always. He'd been out since before dawn, checking the fence lines, and still carried the scent of sage and horseflesh. "My brothers." She smoothed out the letter, handed it to him. "They want more money." His eyes scanned the words, his jaw tightening with each line. "Morrison's interest," he said flatly. "They didn't pay the full debt with my money. Or they're lying. Spent it all and now need more." Margaret turned to the stove, needing something to do with her hands. "I'm sorry. I know you already paid." "You're not going." The finality in his voice made her turn back. "They're still my brothers. They sold you." His voice was dangerously quiet, like livestock, and now they want to milk that sale for more. You don't owe them anything. If I don't go, they'll come here. The thought of Thomas and Henry contaminating this place she'd begun to think of as sanctuary made her feel sick. "I won't have them bringing their poison to our home." Our home. The words slipped out without thought, but she saw Coleman register them, something flickering in his amber eyes. "Then I'll go," he said, Have a conversation with your brothers about the finality of our arrangement. No. The word came out sharper than intended. You don't know them. They're cowards when cornered. Cowards with guns. And Morrison? She shuddered. Morrison plays for keeps. If they owe him, he'll collect one way or another. Coleman moved closer, and she realized he was reading her fear. The unspoken memories of what men like Morrison did to those who couldn't pay. His hand lifted as if to touch her, then dropped. You're my wife, he said quietly. That means your troubles are mine now. We'll go together. Coleman. Together, or I go alone. Those are your choices. She saw the steel in him then, the immovable will that had carved a ranch from wilderness. This wasn't a man who bent easily, who could be swayed by tears or pleas, but beneath that hardness, she thought she glimpsed something else, protectiveness, perhaps even caring. Together then, she agreed. They set out before dawn on Friday, Coleman insisting on bringing 4 of his best men despite Margaret's protests that it would look like intimidation. Good, he'd said. Let them be intimidated. The ride to Clearwater took most of the day. Margaret found herself both dreading and anticipating the return to town. Part of her wanted to show them all, her brothers, the townspeople who'd whispered about her sale, that she'd not only survived, but thrived. The other part wanted only to finish this business and never look back. As they entered the dusty main street, she became aware of the figures she and Coleman cut together. Him in his customary black, sitting his horse like a king, radiating controlled danger. Her in a deep burgundy riding dress he'd had made for her, split skirt allowing her to ride astride. Her posture straight despite the knot in her stomach. They looked like what they were, a power to be reckoned with. The silver dollar squatted on the street like a diseased toad, paint peeling, windows grimy with years of neglect. Even at midday, the sounds of drunken laughter and argument spilled onto the street. Margaret's skin crawled with memories, fetching her brothers from this very establishment, enduring the leers and crude comments of its patrons. Stay close, Coleman murmured as they dismounted. To his men, he said, watch the horses and the exits. Inside, the saloon was a cave of smoke and sour beer. Margaret spotted her brothers immediately. Thomas holding court at a corner table. Henry sprawled beside him. Samuel fidgeting nervously with a glass. They weren't alone. Jake Morrison sat across from them, flanked by 2 men who had guns written all over them despite their attempt at casual poses. Morrison saw them first, his piggy eyes lit with interest, traveling over Margaret in a way that made her feel dirty. Well, the blushing bride returns, and with the infamous Coleman Black, this is an unexpected pleasure. Coleman moved slightly, placing himself between Morrison and Margaret. The subtle shift spoke volumes, and Morrison's smile grew wider. Heard you paid well for her. Black, your taste always did run to quality merchandise. Watch your tongue, Coleman said softly, or lose it. The saloon had gone quiet, patrons edging away from potential violence. Thomas finally looked up, his face cycling through surprise, guilt, and finally settling on false bravado. Margaret, sister, you're looking, well. Thomas. She kept her voice steady despite the anger burning in her chest. I got your letter. Ah, yes, unfortunate business. That, you see, there were complications, interest accumulating, additional debts we'd forgotten. You're lying. The words came out flat. Certain. You spent the money Coleman gave you and now you want more. The answer is no. Henry surged to his feet, swaying slightly. Now see here, you ungrateful. He never finished. Coleman moved faster than thought, his hand closing around Henry's throat, lifting him half off his feet. You were saying... Coleman's voice was conversational, as if he weren't currently choking the life from a man. Morrison's men reached for their guns but froze as Coleman's men materialized in the doorway, rifles ready. The saloon held its breath. Gentlemen, please, Morrison said, though he seemed more amused than alarmed. No need for violence. We're all civilized people here." Coleman released Henry, who collapsed gasping into his chair. "Civilized?" Coleman's laugh was like broken glass. "You're parasites, feeding off desperation and weakness. There's nothing civilized about any of you. Perhaps, but parasites serve a function in nature, Mr. Black. We clean up the mess others leave behind." Morrison's eyes found Margaret again. "Your wife's brothers, for instance, owed me $300. Your generous payment covered that debt, but then they sat down at my tables again that very night. Lost another $200, plus interest, of course. The debt stands at $300 again. Funny how that works." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Of course they had. Given the chance at a fresh start, they'd immediately squandered it. Just as they'd squandered everything their parents had left, everything she'd tried to save. "Show me the markers," Coleman demanded. Morrison produced them with a flourish, IOUs in Thomas's shaky hand. Witnessed and dated, legal enough to hold up, worthless enough to condemn. "I'll give you $100. Coleman said, "Final offer, take it and cancel the debt, or collect from them however you see fit. But know this, my wife is no longer connected to these men. You come after her for their debts, and I'll kill you." Simple as that. Morrison studied him, weighing greed against survival. 200, 100, and they leave town. "Tonight. Don't come back." "Now wait a minute," Thomas started. "Shut up," Margaret said, surprising everyone, including herself. "Just shut up, Thomas. You sold me. Actually sold me, like I was a horse you'd grown tired of feeding, and now you want more? How dare you? You landed on your feet," Henry wheezed, his throat already bruising. "Got yourself a rich husband, fine clothes. We got nothing. You got $600. What you did with it is your own fault. Family's supposed to stick together," Samuel said quietly, speaking up for the first time. "Help each other." "Family?" Margaret laughed, and it was a bitter sound. "You stopped being my family the day you let them put a price on me. Coleman's shown me more kindness in 2 months than you did in 20 years. It was true, she realized as she said it, for all his coldness, his distance. Coleman had never treated her as less than human. He'd given her respect, protection, purpose, things her own blood had never thought to offer. Morrison cleared his throat. "Touching as this reunion is, I have a business to run." 100, you say, and they leave town?" Coleman pulled out a leather pouch, counting out gold coins onto the table. "Tonight, if I see any of them after sunrise, our deal's void." "Fair enough." Morrison scooped up the coins, his smile never wavering. "Pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Black, boys. I believe you have some packing to do." Thomas stood slowly, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "Margaret, no?" She stepped back as he reached for her. "We're done. Thomas, whatever we were to each other, it's finished. Don't write, don't visit. If you have any decency left, you'll honor that." "Come on," Henry growled, pulling at Thomas's arm. "We got what we came for." But they hadn't, not really. They'd wanted to milk their connection to her for years, probably. This cut them off, left them adrift. Margaret felt no satisfaction in the knowledge, only a deep weariness. As they turned to leave, Samuel hung back. "Maggie, I'm sorry, for what it's worth. I should have stopped them, but you didn't." She met his eyes, seeing the boy he'd been, the man he'd failed to become. "Goodbye, Samuel." Outside, the sun was beginning its descent, painting Clearwater Creek in shades of gold and shadow. Margaret stood on the boardwalk, breathing in air that seemed cleaner than the saloon's fetid atmosphere. "You all right?" Coleman asked. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I thought I'd feel something, anger, sadness, even relief, but there's just nothing. Sometimes nothing is a mercy." He untied their horses, handing her Buttercup's reins. "Come on, let's go home." Home. There was that word again, falling from his lips as naturally as breath. They mounted up, Coleman's men forming a protective circle as they rode out. At the edge of town, Margaret turned back for one last look. Regrets? Coleman asked. No, just making sure it's real, that I'm really free of them. You are, I promise you that. They rode in comfortable silence as the miles unwound beneath their horses' hooves. The sun set in spectacular fashion, painting the sky in shades of fire and wine. As darkness fell, they made camp by a small spring, Coleman's men efficiently setting up tents and starting a fire. Margaret found herself sitting beside Coleman as they ate, their shoulders almost touching. The events of the day seemed like something from another lifetime, another world. Thank you, she said quietly, for coming with me, for handling them. They're lucky I only handled them. His voice carried a dark edge. When I think about what they did to you, it brought me to you, she said without thinking, then felt heat rise in her cheeks. I mean, to the ranch, to a better life. He turned to look at her, firelight dancing in his eyes. Is it better? Yes. The answer came without hesitation. Whatever else you are, Coleman Black, you're not cruel. You don't treat me as less than... That alone makes you better than they ever were. That's a low bar to clear. Maybe, but you clear it all the same. They sat in silence, but it was different from their early silences. This one felt full of possibility, of things unsaid but not unfelt, when she shivered in the cooling night air. He shifted closer, not quite touching but sharing warmth. There's something I should tell you, he said eventually. About Morrison. He won't let this go easy. Men like him, they hold grudges. He'll honor the deal. He's too smart not to, but he'll remember being backed down. Might cause trouble later, then we'll face it when it comes. She surprised herself with the confidence in her voice. Together. Together. He agreed. And she thought she heard something like wonder in his voice. That night, as she lay in her tent listening to the fire crackle and the horses shift, Margaret felt something inside her settle. A chapter of her life had closed today, ugly and painful but finished. Tomorrow, they'd return to the ranch, to the life they were building stone by stone, day by day. She thought of Coleman, probably still awake, keeping watch as he always did, protecting what was his with fierce dedication. And she was his now, not as property. She was beginning to understand, but as something more complex, partner, companion, perhaps, eventually, something even deeper. The stars wheeled overhead, eternal and unchanging, but here on Earth, everything was in flux, and for the first time in her life, Margaret welcomed the change. The storm arrived without warning, as storms in the desert often did. One moment the sky was clear, stars scattered like spilled diamonds across black velvet. The next, clouds boiled up from the horizon, swallowing the moon and bringing with them a wind that howled like all the demons of hell. Margaret woke to the sound of thunder cracking overhead, so loud it seemed to split the very air. Lightning illuminated her room in stark, white flashes, revealing the curtains whipping frantically at windows she'd left open for the evening breeze. She rushed to close them, fighting against the wind that wanted to tear them from her hands. Rain began to lash against the glass, not the gentle rain of eastern storms, but the violent downpour of the desert, months of moisture released in minutes. A different sound made her freeze, the panicked screaming of horses. The barn. Some of the mares were due to foal, and a storm like this could send them into dangerous panic. Margaret threw on her robe and boots, not bothering with proper dress. The hallway was dark, but another lightning flash showed Coleman's door standing open. His room empty. Of course he was already out there. Probably had been the moment the storm began. She flew down the stairs and out into the tempest. The wind hit her like a physical blow, driving rain that stung like needles. She could barely see 3 feet ahead, but she knew the path to the barn by heart now, had walked it countless times over the past months. The barn doors stood open, banging against their frames. Inside, she could hear horses crying out, hooves thundering against stall walls. A lantern swung crazily from a beam, casting wild shadows. "Coleman!" she called, but the wind tore her voice away. She found him in the far stall with Duchess, one of his prize mares. The horse was down, sides heaving, eyes rolling white with fear and pain. Coleman knelt beside her, his hands gentle on her swollen sides, but Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders. "Foal's turned wrong," he said without looking up. "She's been laboring too long." Margaret dropped to her knees beside him, heedless of the straw and mud. "What can I do?" "Hold her head. Talk to her. Keep her calm if you can." Margaret cradled the mare's head in her lap, stroking the sweat-dampened neck, murmuring soothing nonsense. Duchess's eyes found hers, dark and liquid and full of an ancient female understanding, the fear and pain of bringing life into the world. Coleman worked with focused intensity, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he tried to reposition the foal. The storm raged around them, wind screaming through the gaps in the barn walls, but inside this stall, there was only the mare's labored breathing and Coleman's quiet encouragements. "There," he breathed suddenly. "Got it. Come on, girl. One more push." Duchess strained, her whole body shuddering with effort. Margaret held her tighter, feeling the mare's pain as if it were her own. Then, in a rush of fluid and motion, the foal slid free, a dark, wet bundle of legs and possibility. Coleman quickly cleared its airways, and the foal drew its first breath, a tiny sound almost lost in the storm's fury. But to Margaret, it sounded like a miracle. "It's a filly," Coleman said, and she heard something in his voice she'd never heard before, pure, uncomplicated joy. "Perfect little filly." He helped the foal to Duchess's side, guiding it to nurse. The mare, exhausted but instinct strong, nuzzled her baby with infinite tenderness. Margaret found herself crying, tears mixing with the rain that had soaked through her robe. The sight of new life, of such fierce love and protection, touched something deep inside her. "Hey," Coleman said softly, noticing her tears. "It's all right. They're both fine." "I know," she said, laughing a little at herself. "It's just beautiful." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she became suddenly aware of how she must appear, soaked through, her robe clinging, hair plastered to her head. But there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch, something warm and wanting. "You're cold," he said, voice rough. "We should get you inside." "Not yet." She wasn't ready to leave this moment, this small circle of life and warmth, while the storm raged beyond. "Can we stay? Just a little longer?" He nodded, shrugging out of his coat and wrapping it around her shoulders. It was warm from his body, carrying his scent, and she pulled it close. They sat together in the straw, watching mother and baby bond, not speaking but somehow communicating in the silence. The storm's fury gradually spent itself, thunder growing distant, rain softening to a patter on the barn roof. Other hands appeared, checking on horses, but they gave the stall a wide berth, sensing something private in the scene. "My mother loves storms," Coleman said suddenly, surprising them both. "Said they washed the world clean, gave everything a fresh start." "She sounds wise. Would have liked you. I think you have her strength." Margaret looked at him, this hard man who so rarely spoke of anything personal. "Tell me about her?" He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "She was tiny, barely came to my father's shoulder, but she had a spine of steel, came from good family back east. Could have married anyone. Chose my father instead. Followed him to Pennsylvania when everyone said she was mad to do it. Love makes us brave," Margaret said softly. "Or foolish." But there was no bitterness in it, only old sadness. "She turned our house into a home, had a garden, even in that rocky soil, sang while she worked, made my father laugh, which was no easy feat. You miss her, every day." He shifted, his shoulder brushing hers. "The fire, I was away at school. By the time I got home, there was nothing left but ashes and my father sitting in them like his soul had burned too." Margaret reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. He let her, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Long time ago," he said, but his grip tightened. "Sometimes, though, I see something. A woman working in her garden, a mother with her child, and it all comes rushing back. Is that why you never married? Before, I mean, he turned to look at her. Partly, mostly because I never found anyone who... He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. This land is hard. It takes everything soft and either breaks it or turns it to leather. I needed someone who could bend without breaking, who could find beauty in harshness. Never thought I'd find that. And now, the question slipped out before she could stop it. His free hand came up, cupping her face with impossible gentleness. Now I'm starting to think I was looking in the wrong places. The air between them crackled with more than storm residue. Margaret's heart raced as his thumb traced her cheekbone, her jaw, coming to rest at the corner of her mouth. Coleman, she breathed. Tell me to stop, he said roughly. Tell me this isn't what you want. I can't. The truth of it overwhelmed her. I can't tell you that. He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the brief brush of lips at their wedding. This was fire and need and months of careful distance crumbling to dust. She tasted rain and desperation, felt the control he always wore like armor crack and fall away. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the world had shifted on its axis. Margaret, he said her name like a prayer, like a revelation. Take me inside, she whispered. Please. He stood, pulling her up with him, keeping her close as if afraid she might vanish. They left the barn, walking through the last of the rain, not running but not dawdling either. The house loomed before them, dark and waiting. Inside. He paused at the stairs. Are you certain? Once we do this, we're already married. She reminded him. Have been for months. In name. This would make it real, make you mine in truth. Then make me yours, she said simply. He swept her up in his arms, carrying her up the stairs as if she weighed nothing. In his room, their room now. Truly. He set her down gently, his hands trembling slightly as they pushed the wet robe from her shoulders. You're so beautiful, he said, wonder in his voice. Do you know that? Do you have any idea what you've done to me these past months? Tell me, she urged, her own hands working at the buttons of his shirt. Driven me mad, he admitted. Watching you work, seeing you gentle the horses, hearing you hum in the kitchen, wanting to touch you and forcing myself not to, telling myself you were bought, not won, that you couldn't really want this. I want this, she assured him. I want you, not because you bought me, but because you freed me, showed me I could be strong. They came together like the storm itself, wild and necessary, washing away months of careful distance. He was gentle despite his hunger, treating her like something precious even as passion consumed them both. And when the storm finally passed, leaving them tangled together in the aftermath, Margaret understood what home truly meant. It wasn't walls and a roof. It wasn't even safety from those who would harm you. Home was this, lying in the arms of someone who saw all of you, darkness and light, and chose to hold on anyway. I love you, Coleman said against her hair, the words seeming to surprise him. Didn't mean to, tried not to, but there it is. I love you too, she replied, meaning it with every fiber of her being. Not because you saved me, because you let me save myself. They lay quiet then, listening to the gentle rain that followed the storm's fury. Outside, the world was washed clean, ready for new growth. Inside, two hearts that had been islands unto themselves finally found their harbor. The foal, Margaret said suddenly. We should check on them. Ezra's with them, Coleman assured her, pressing a kiss to her temple. Let someone else keep watch for once. It was a new concept for him. She realized, trusting others, letting go of constant vigilance. She snuggled closer, marveling at the peace in his face, the way years seemed to have fallen away. What are you thinking? She asked. That my mother was right. He said, storms do wash things clean, give fresh starts. And what are we starting fresh? He rolled to face her, his expression serious. Everything, this marriage, this ranch, this life. If you're willing, I'm willing, she promised. They sealed it with another kiss, slow and deep and full of promise. Outside, dawn was breaking, painting the rain-washed world in shades of gold and rose. It was a new day, in more ways than one. And in the barn, a little filly took her first wobbly steps, guided by her mother's gentle encouragement. Life went on, renewed and vibrant. On the Black Ranch, Margaret thought of the girl she'd been, sold and hopeless, sure her life was over. How wrong she'd been. It hadn't been an ending at all. It had been a beginning. The attack came at dawn, when the world was painted in shades of gray and rose. Margaret woke to the thunder of hooves and Coleman's voice, sharp with urgency. Get dressed. Get armed. Now. She rolled from bed, hands already reaching for the rifle he'd taught her to use. Through the window, she could see them, 40 riders or more, spreading across the valley like a plague of locusts. Morrison's men. She realized with a sick lurch, but more than he'd ever commanded before. He'd gathered an army. Coleman was already dressed, strapping on his gun belt with practiced efficiency. They're after the herd in the south pasture, probably figure to drive them into the canyon, make off with half our stock before we can respond. But that's, she did quick calculations, that's near 1,000 head. Worth dying for, in Morrison's mind. He checked his rifles, movements sharp and economical. Stay in the house. Ezra will. No. She was already pulling on her riding clothes. We've been through this. I'm not hiding while you fight for our ranch. This isn't rustlers taking pot shots. Margaret, this is war. Then we'd better win it. He stared at her for a heartbeat, and she saw him weighing protection against pragmatism. They were outnumbered badly. He needed every gun. Fine, but you stay with me. No heroics. They ran for the barn, finding chaos already erupting. The hands were saddling horses, checking weapons, faces grim with understanding. This wasn't just another raid. This was Morrison's play for everything. Tom, Coleman barked. Take 5 men. Circle east. Try to turn the herd before they reach the canyon. Ezra, you and the rest with me. We'll hit them from the north. Try to break their line. What about the house? Ezra asked. Leave it. The cattle are what they want. Without the herd, the ranch dies anyway. They rode out into the breaking dawn. 30 men against 40 or more. The odds weren't good, but Margaret had learned that Coleman Black didn't fight by odds. He fought smart, using terrain and surprise to even the scales. The sound of gunfire reached them before they crested the rise, sharp cracks echoing across the valley. Below, she could see the mass of cattle being driven hard toward the canyon, riders whooping and firing into the air to keep them running. Morrison's men had them moving fast, too fast to turn easily. There, Coleman pointed. Morrison's keeping back, letting his hired guns do the work. Cut off the head. The snake dies. They swept down the hillside like an avalanche, Coleman leading the charge. The surprise was total. Morrison's men had been focused on the cattle, not expecting attack from this angle. The two forces collided in a chaos of horses and gunfire. Margaret stayed close to Coleman as ordered, but there was no safety in this melee. A rider bore down on them, gun raised. She fired without thinking, weeks of practice paying off. The man tumbled from his saddle, and she felt no regret, only fierce satisfaction. The battle raged across the grassland, men falling on both sides. Through the dust and gun smoke, she saw Tom Garrett's group hit the riders from the east, trying to turn the stampeding herd. Some of the cattle began to mill, their headlong flight disrupted. Then she saw him, Morrison, hanging back as Coleman had predicted, protected by his best gunmen. Coleman saw him too, and she knew what he intended before he spurred his horse forward. Coleman, no! But he was already gone, cutting through the battle like a blade. Margaret followed, firing at anyone who tried to intercept them. Her blood sang with adrenaline and fear, the world narrowing to this moment, this fight. One of Morrison's guards got off a shot that took Coleman's hat. Coleman's return fire took the man from his saddle. The second guard's horse reared, spoiling his aim. Margaret shot him before he could recover. Then it was just Morrison, his piggy eyes wide with fear as Coleman bore down on him. The saloon keeper went for his gun, but Coleman was already too close. The two men crashed together, tumbling from their horses to roll in the dust. Margaret leaped from Buttercup, rifle ready. But the two men were too entangled to risk a shot. They fought with primitive fury, all pretense of civilization stripped away. Morrison was larger, but Coleman was rage incarnate. Months of controlled anger finally given release. A shadow moved behind her. She spun to find one of Morrison's men, gun raised. Time slowed. She saw death in his eyes, knew she couldn't bring her rifle around in time. The shot was impossibly loud. The man's expression went slack, and he toppled forward. Behind him stood Ezra, smoking pistol in hand. "Watch your back, ma'am." She nodded, throat too tight for words, and turned back to see Coleman rising from Morrison's still form. Blood ran from a cut on his cheek. His shirt was torn, but he was alive, gloriously, fiercely alive. Around them, the battle was winding down. Morrison's hired guns, seeing their paymaster fall, were already fleeing. The stampede had been turned, the cattle milling in confusion but no longer running for the canyon. "Is he dead?" Margaret asked, looking at Morrison's crumpled form. "No, but he'll wish he was." Coleman retrieved his hat, examining the bullet hole with disgust. "This was my favorite. Despite everything, the violence, the death, the acrid smell of gunpowder." Margaret laughed. "Trust Coleman to mourn his hat in the midst of carnage." "Ma'am," Tom Garrett rode up, grinning despite a bloody arm. "We turned them. Didn't lose but maybe 50 head. "How many men?" Coleman asked. The question every leader dreaded. 3 dead, 6 wounded, but none too bad. Could have been worse. 3 men. Margaret felt the weight of it, even in victory. 3 families who'd received terrible news. 3 graves to dig. "Get them home," Coleman ordered. "See to the wounded. I'll deal with this trash." Morrison groaned, showing signs of returning consciousness. Coleman hauled him roughly to his feet, and Margaret saw fear replace arrogance in the saloon keeper's eyes. "You're done in this territory," Coleman said, voice cold as winter stone. "You'll sign over your properties to cover damages, then you'll leave. Tonight, show your face again, and I'll kill you where you stand." "You can't." Coleman's fist cut off the protest, dropping Morrison back to the dirt. I will. Your choice whether you leave vertical or horizontal." The ride back to the ranch was subdued despite their victory. Margaret rode beside Coleman, noting new lines of tension in his face. Defending what was his had cost him more than just the men they'd lost. "You're hurt," she said, seeing blood seeping through his shirt. "It's nothing. Let me see." He sighed but reined in his horse, letting her examine the wound. A bullet had grazed his ribs, leaving a furrow that would scar but wasn't serious. "You're lucky," she said, using his own bandana to bind it. "No," he corrected, catching her hand. "I'm blessed, having you beside me, fighting for our home. Margaret, I've never seen anything like it. I told you, partners." "Partners," he agreed, lifting her hand to his lips. They returned to find the ranch in organized chaos. The wounded were being tended in the bunkhouse, Rosa having arrived to help with medical care. The dead were laid out respectfully, awaiting burial. "I'll speak to their families," Coleman said quietly. "See they're provided for." This was the side of leadership Margaret was still learning, the weight of sending men into danger, of decisions that cost lives. She took his hand, offering silent support. That evening, after the wounded were stable and the dead prepared for burial, they stood on the porch watching the sun set. The events of the day seemed almost dreamlike, too intense to fully process. "It's over," Coleman said. "Morrison's broken. Word will spread. Others will think twice before trying us." "At what cost?" "The price of keeping what's ours. It's never cheap. Margaret, freedom never is." She leaned into him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "Would you do it again? All of it? To protect this ranch? To protect you? Every time?" "I mean buying me," she clarified. bringing me here. He turned her to face him, hands gentle on her shoulders. That wasn't buying. I see that now. That was destiny wearing a crude mask. You weren't meant for that life. Margaret, you were meant for this, for strength, for purpose, for standing beside me against whatever comes. Together, she said, the word that had become their touchstone. Together, he confirmed, sealing it with a kiss that tasted of dust and blood and victory. That night, they made love with a desperate intensity born of proximity to death. Every touch was a reaffirmation of life. Every whispered word a promise that they'd survived, would continue to survive. I could have lost you today, Coleman said against her skin, his usual control shattered. When I saw that man behind you, but you didn't. We didn't lose each other. She held him close, feeling his heart race against hers. We won, Coleman, not just the battle, everything. He pulled back to look at her, and in his amber eyes she saw a future stretching wide as the territory itself. Everything, he agreed. Outside, coyotes sang their wild songs to the stars. But inside, two hearts beat as one, having proven that some things were worth any price, any sacrifice, any struggle. The Black Ranch had held more than that. It had become what Coleman always dreamed, not just land and cattle, but a true home, a place where love could grow as fierce and wild as the country itself. Margaret fell asleep in her husband's arms, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, they'd face it as they'd faced today. Together. Always together. The morning of their wedding, their true wedding, dawned crystal clear. The sky an endless expanse of blue silk. 6 months had passed since Morrison's defeat. 6 months of building not just a ranch, but a life together. Now, Margaret stood before the mirror in her room, hardly recognizing the woman who stared back. Gone was the pale, thin girl who'd been sold like cattle. In her place stood a woman bronzed by sun and strengthened by purpose, wearing a dress of cream silk that Coleman had ordered from San Francisco. Rosa fussed with her hair, weaving small white flowers from the desert into the auburn strands. You are radiant, Senora, Rosa said, stepping back to admire her work. Senor Black will lose his words when he sees you. Margaret laughed. Coleman never has many words to lose. But that had changed too, hadn't it? The silent, brooding man she'd married had gradually opened like a flower in the desert, revealing depths she'd never imagined. He still wasn't given to flowery speeches, but he spoke to her now, really spoke, sharing dreams and fears and memories. A knock came at the door. Margaret? Ezra's voice. It's time. She took a deep breath, smoothing her skirts. This was what they'd decided, to have a real wedding. One entered into freely, witnessed by the community they'd fought to protect. The whole territory had been invited, and from her window she could see wagons arriving, people gathering on the lawn they'd prepared. Outside, the ranch had been transformed. Tables groaned under the weight of food. Lanterns hung from every available surface, and a small altar had been erected beneath the great cottonwood that shaded the main house. It was simple but perfect, exactly what she'd dreamed. Tom Garrett waited to escort her, his arm in a sling from their battle, but his smile bright. Ready, Mrs. Black? Ready to become Mrs. Black properly, she corrected, taking his offered arm. The assembled crowd turned as she appeared, but Margaret had eyes only for Coleman. He stood at the altar in a black suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, his usually wild hair tamed for the occasion, but it was his expression that stopped her heart. Wonder and love and a vulnerability he'd never shown in public before. Judge Hartley waited at the altar, the same man who'd married them that first time, but everything else was different. This time, when he asked if she came of her own free will, her yes rang out clear and strong. This time, when Coleman took her hands, they were steady and sure. Margaret, Coleman said, having insisted on speaking his own vows, you came to me in darkness, both of us bound by circumstances we didn't choose, but you became my light, my partner, my salvation. You showed me that strength isn't about standing alone. It's about standing together. I promise to spend every day proving worthy of the trust you've placed in me." Margaret blinked back tears, squeezing his hands. "Coleman, you gave me freedom when you could have given me a cage. You saw me not as property, but as a person, capable of standing beside you. You taught me to shoot, to ride, to fight, but more than that, you taught me to believe in myself. I choose you not because I must, but because I cannot imagine any other life than one spent by your side." When Judge Hartley pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss Coleman gave her was neither brief nor proper. It was a claiming and a promise, deep enough to make several of the older ladies fan themselves and the cowboys whoop with appreciation. The celebration that followed was like nothing the territory had seen. Tables were laden with beef from their own herds, vegetables from the garden Margaret had coaxed from the desert soil, and cake that Rosa had labored over for days. Musicians played, couples danced, and for one perfect day, the hardships of frontier life were forgotten. "Happy?" Coleman asked as they swayed together. Neither particularly skilled at dancing, but not caring. "Beyond words," Margaret assured him. "Though I'm surprised you agreed to all this. It's not exactly your style. You've changed my style," he said simply. "Besides, I wanted everyone to see what I see, that Margaret Black is no bought bride, but a woman who chose her life and her man freely." As if summoned by his words, a commotion arose near the tables. Margaret turned to see 3 familiar figures hovering at the edge of the celebration, hats in hands. Her brothers, thinner, worn. But there, Coleman's hand went immediately to his gun, but Margaret stopped him. "Let me." She approached them, head high, aware of every eye upon her. Thomas stepped forward, looking far older than his years. "Margaret, we heard about the wedding, the real one. And we wanted to say," he struggled, pride warring with something that might have been genuine regret. "We were wrong. What we did. You deserved better from us." Henry, surprisingly, spoke up. "You look well. Happy. That's good." Samuel held out a small wrapped package. "It was Ma's. Thought you should have it." Margaret unwrapped it slowly, revealing her mother's silver hairbrush, the one beautiful thing from their childhood. Her throat tightened. "Thank you," she said quietly. "We're leaving." Thomas said, "California, fresh start. Just wanted to see you once more, make things, if not right, at least not so wrong." Margaret looked at these men who'd been her family, who'd failed her so completely. She felt Coleman's presence behind her, solid and protective, but also waiting, letting her handle this her way. "I forgive you," she said finally. "Not for your sake, but for mine. I won't carry that weight anymore." Relief flickered across their faces. They nodded, turned to go. Then Thomas looked back. "Be happy, sister. I already am." They left then, 3 shadows from a past that no longer had power over her. Coleman's arm came around her waist, pulling her close. "That was well done," he murmured. "They're my past," she said. "You're my future." It seemed important to make peace with one to fully embrace the other. The celebration continued until well past sunset, lanterns casting golden light over laughing faces. Children ran between tables, couples danced, and stories were shared of the battle with Morrison, growing more dramatic with each telling. As the evening wound down, Coleman stood, raising his glass. The crowd quieted. "6 months ago," he said, his deep voice carrying clearly, "I was a man alone, building an empire with no one to share it with. Then Margaret came into my life, and everything changed. She stood beside me against rustlers and storms, fought for this ranch as fiercely as any man here, but more than that, she's made this place a home." He turned to her, and the love in his eyes made her breath catch. "So I ask you all to raise your glasses to my wife, Margaret Black, the strongest, bravest, most beautiful woman in the territory, and the only one fool enough to take on a wild man like me." The toast was drunk with enthusiasm, cheers ringing across the desert. Margaret stood, pulling Coleman down for another kiss that set off more whooping. Later, As they stood on their porch watching the last wagons disappear into the darkness, Margaret leaned into her husband's embrace. "No regrets?" he asked, echoing their conversation from months ago. "None," she assured him. "Though I do wonder what would have happened if Thomas hadn't gotten into debt. If you'd never come to buy a wife, I'd have found you anyway." Coleman said with such certainty it made her shiver. "Some things are written in the stars. Margaret, we were always meant to find each other. Above them, those stars wheeled in their eternal dance, witness to all the dreams and struggles of the people below. The desert wind whispered through the cottonwood leaves, carrying the scent of sage and possibility." "What now?" Margaret asked. "Now we build," Coleman said. "We raise cattle and children. We make this ranch something that will last generations. We live, Margaret, freely and fully. Together," she said, their favorite word. "Together," he agreed, leading her inside. In the distance, a wolf howled, not mournful but triumphant, a wild cry of joy that echoed across the vast lands of the Black Ranch. It was answered by another, then another, until the night rang with their fierce music. Margaret smiled, understanding their song. It was the sound of freedom, of belonging, of home. And as she followed her husband inside, ready to begin the rest of their lives, she knew that she too had found where she belonged, not as property or possession, but as partner, equal, beloved. The girl sold by her brothers had become a woman who stood tall under the western sky, afraid of nothing, ready for everything. And that, she thought as Coleman swept her into his arms, was the greatest transformation of all. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. If you enjoyed this tale of Margaret and Coleman's journey from a dark beginning to true love and partnership, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please subscribe to our channel From Wild West and share your thoughts about their story in the comments below. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to bring you more tales from the untamed frontier.